Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's afternoon for everybody I see on here. Sometimes we have people where it's tomorrow, so it's morning there, but I think it's afternoon here. I'm Paula McElwee, and I'm going to be facilitating a call with all of you who are the financial managers, some of you in your role as executive directors, and some of you in your role as bookkeepers or accountants for centers. And we're going to have a call about the things that we need to talk about regarding reporting to boards. I'll give you a quick description. I'm an older woman with silver hair and Scottish complexion. I have several disabilities, including that I have a chronic pain condition and I have a neurological glitch that can cause me to not be able to speak for a few seconds. And if that happens, just be patient. I'll be right back. It never lasts for very long. And I'm here to provide this information to you through what's called the ILNet. So most of you are probably familiar with this by now, but it's a National Training and Technical Assistance Center for both centers and Silks. And we're based out of Houston, Texas, but we have partners all over the country. As I said, we're going to talk about what and how do you report to your board. And here are those partners I mentioned: ILRU, April, which is the Association for Programs for Rural Independent Living, NICL, which is the National Council on Independent Living, and the University of Montana, which is actually my employer in this partnership. And we're going to discuss today what some of this is sensitive. And right now we're recording, and this recording is going to be posted on our website. So if you have questions or comments about some of this sensitive stuff that you don't want to be posted on the website, give us a chance to get through the few slides we have, and then we're going to discuss this. We're going to turn off the cameras and discuss it a little more freely. So, so be aware that you don't have to share to the cameras. You will have a chance to share it later. But we're going to talk first about routine reports. What do you provide to your board? I'm hoping you'll jump in on some of these. So I'm going to tell you what I think are important reports, and then I'm hoping you'll also jump in and tell me what you think are important reports, right? So, and they may not be exactly the same. We're going to talk about when do you provide notes or explanations for those reports, because sometimes that's just as important as the financial report itself, especially because you're reporting here to the board of directors. And board members are not always fully familiar with how financial reports are put together, right? So, so we're going to talk about notes or explanations. We're also going to talk about when and how the auditor is part of board reporting, because most, if not all of you, get an independent audit annually of your financial statements, and that audit should be part of the board reporting. We're also going to talk about whether or not you're excluded from these board meetings. And I put it in a little bit more blunt language here. What if your executive director doesn't want the board to know something? How do you handle that very sensitive issue? So we're going to talk a little about that. That's the part where I'm expecting that you're not going to want to be on camera if you have questions and comments on that one. Okay, so those are kind of the areas we're going to cover. Let's talk first about those routine financial reports. You may do quarterly financial reports. Typically, that's if your board meets quarterly. You do a quarterly report to them so that they are up to date from the last time that the board met. So it's a quarterly financial report. You also will do monthly financial reports. Your executive director needs them anyway. Your executive director needs timely reports. I'm not talking much about timeliness here today, but I do want to make a statement about timeliness. And my statement about timeliness is if you're not able to do timely financial reports, you need to figure out why that is. Because timely financial information is essential for good management. So if as the bookkeeper or as the accountant, you're seeing financial reports that are delayed, 6 weeks past the end of the month or something like that, that really is not timely. And it's not timely enough for the board or for your executive director, for that matter, to make good decisions. So if you're doing a monthly financial report, but your board only meets quarterly, typically there's a finance committee that reviews that monthly report. So I want you to keep that in mind. If you don't have a finance committee of your board, I strongly suggest that you look at that, even if it's only the treasurer and one other person, that someone other than the executive director and the accountant or bookkeeper ought to be looking at financial reports in some detail and meeting with you about that to get their questions answered so that they're confident about the content of those financial reports. So a finance committee is one way to do that. That's the most common way to make that happen. So here are the reports that I suggest are included to your board. Now, a lot of times people will say the first thing that they'll say is, I don't know, you can plug these into the meeting chat, what reports you do if you do other reports. But often people will say a balance sheet. And I suppose you need to be providing a balance sheet, but frankly, balance sheets are not very useful to me. As a manager, I didn't find them useful. And as a board member, I didn't find them useful because they're a snapshot at that one moment in time. And they really don't give you a view of the status of the organization, larger than that. So they don't tell me what I need to know to be a good board member, and they don't tell me what I need to know to be an executive director. What I need to know what was our budget and what did we actually spend. And I need to know that by grant or funding source. And I need to know it both for the month and for the year to date. And I need to see it consolidated. Okay. So both consolidated and by funding source, and both monthly and year to date. I'm going to get up and close the door to my office. I'm getting feedback. I don't know if you can hear it, but I can't. So just. All right. So those are the things that I feel are the most important reports. They're the most useful reports to me. And I hope that you will plug in what other reports you feel like are important and put that in. Now, your liabilities are included in a balance sheet, and you do need to know what debt you have. So that may be where that's noted, or you may want to have a separate report just related to your debt or your line of credit if you use one. But any debt that you have or any use of the line of credit really does need to be communicated to the board and to the executive director. These reports also are useful as tools for the executive director's management. But I feel like those are essential. I have seen, unfortunately, more than one situation where an executive director dug a deeper debt hole than the board was aware of by using a line of credit, maxing it out and then not knowing what to do to make ends meet after that because there's no more cash flow. And they got themselves stuck. So the board really does need to know the status of any line of credit or any debt that's going on. That might be credit card debt. It might be debt on your building. But the board needs to see that that's being paid down, that you're not, failing to make payments on anything that you owe and so forth. So those would be important to me. What else are you guys doing? What other reports are you requesting or providing related to your financial status? Anybody else have something?
Paula, this is
Yes.
Mary Sizer.
Hi, Mary.
My board requests, as you said, the budget to actual, but I like the presenting by month and then by year. The consolidated one, I can make sense of it, but it doesn't mean as much as the by month. But anyway, the only other report our board asks for is a cash flow statement.
Cash flow is always good, right? Because that's a reality for all of us that we're juggling a little bit. Different fiscal years sometimes for different grant sources. And so that's real important. A couple of things that have popped up in the chat, and then I'll come to you, Flossie, in just 30 seconds. Accounts receivable related to fees for service. I also look sometimes at aging in accounts receivable, because if your fees for service aren't paying on time, it's causing sometimes a real serious, yeah, Beth just added that with aging. Yep. Quarterly profit and loss versus quarterly versus prior year. So that is some good information comparing the current status to other things, so that there's a good communication about how this compares to prior years, how last month compares to this month, what it looks like if we spread it over the year. All of that is good information, right? So taking a look at major variances, that's another good one. So when you have a budget versus actual, you can also have a variance related to either of those. And are you over or under by what percentage? Sometimes you have a policy or procedure, in fact, related to being over or under budget in your spending, because it's an important piece of information for the board to know, the status of things. So you certainly are looking at the status of things. Other comments or questions? Anybody want to pop in? Other kinds of reports that you use. The board asked for a 3-year trend analysis, Hilda said, and I think that also is very good information for making good management decisions on the part of the board, but also on the part of the executive director. And some of you I know are fairly new executive directors, and for you to see that history is especially useful, because you can see, okay, how are we doing compared to a year ago and 2 years ago and so forth. But I want you to think of your financial reports this way. They're tools. And if the board is making certain decisions, what tools do they need in order to make good ones? And sometimes your treasurer is good at this, or someone else on the board who's on the finance committee is, a banker or runs another nonprofit or has other experience where they know what to bring to this report. But a lot of times they don't. And so you need to be thinking in terms of, what could I provide that would be helpful to the decisions that are being made right now? And that's all kinds of decisions. Sometimes, of course, it's approaching your budget year. It's decisions around next year's spending. But a lot of times it's also decisions around, whether or not you continue a fee-for-service program. Is it really paying for itself or not? Is it bringing in enough to make it worthwhile? It doesn't have to break even if it's something that's IL related, because you can subsidize it through your federal funds. That's a conversation for another day, because there are things you can and can't do, but you need to the board needs to make decisions, the executive director needs to make decisions, and you need to provide them with the tools or the information to make that happen. Now, the annual financial audit, I didn't give him give it its own slide, but we'll talk about it here. The annual independent financial audit, even very small centers should be doing some kind of financial statement audit by a third party. So if your center is not doing that, please let's talk. Some organizations were under the impression that they weren't allowed to do that it wasn't an allowable cost if you're small, and that's not true. And let me tell you why and describe this a little bit to you. So the regulations around spending federal money say that you cannot have a single audit. I'll come back and define that in a minute. Unless you spent more than $750,000 in federal funds. And if you spent more than $750,000 in federal funds in a given year, then you are required to have what's called a single audit. This is a special federal audit. It combines all of your funding sources, and it looks deeper into allowable and non-allowable costs than the other kind of audit I'm going to talk about. So if you spent less than $750,000 in federal funds in a given year, you cannot spend federal funds on this kind of an audit. But you can have a financial statement audit. That's what you need to call it. That's how you need to describe it when you get contracts or bids or proposals from an auditor. It is an allowable cost. So if you've been under the impression that it's not an allowable cost under your grants, or if your state is under that impression, I did run across that in one situation, we need to talk and straighten that out, because you need an independent financial audit, in my opinion. Now, you're not required to have one if you spent less than $750,000 in federal funds, but it is good practice. You are responsible for a whole bunch of other people's money in your grants and fees, and you want to make sure that nothing inappropriate is going on, and some third party looking at your finances is one of the ways you assure that. Now, that said, that was kind of background. That said, your policies should specify that it's the board that chooses this auditor, not the executive director. Because this auditor is going to report to the board on the financial status of the organization. The board should choose the auditor, and the auditor should come to a board meeting with the reports and hand them out to the board members and answer their questions directly. This should not be filtered by the executive director. If your executive director, we're going to come back to if the executive director blocks some of this in a minute, but if the executive director does not want to do it this way, then we ought to talk about best practices, and we ought to talk about policies and procedures, and we ought to talk about how we can move from this situation where the executive director has been controlling the audit process to a situation where the board is in control of it. So when we talk more about how you can change the transparency, the financial transparency of your organization, we'll talk about that a little more. Other routine financial reports include the reports from state or federal reviews around finance. Okay, so What you should have is a situation where you, if you have a review, they have findings, like, just like your audit, they have findings or recommendations or both. And you respond to them and tell them, you meaning the executive director and staff, respond to the state or federal reviewers and tell them how you're going to fix it. But the board needs to be informed at every step of this process. So they need to know what the state or federal review said, and they need to know the response of the organization to that review. Now, Beth said our auditing firm just reached out to us to recommend a review where they balance supporting documentation and perform analytical procedures or a compilation that's similar to the audit report. Yeah, and that is an option. My concern isn't which methodology is used so much that there is a third-party review. So as your board looks at options, that would be, the main thing is you have a third-party review, like the audits that you have been having, Beth, and going on from there. Okay. So let's talk a second about what needs notes or explanations. And these notes or explanations, you have to decide how you do them. Sometimes your reporting process allows you to put notes in the document itself. And of course, I find that to be the most convenient because I'm looking at the document and then I'm looking at the notes, right? And there's some kind of a process for that, whether you exported it to Excel and put the notes in there, or whether you exported it to a Word document, a chart in a Word document, and you put your notes there. It gives you an opportunity, certainly, to tell the board more things that they might need to know about the report that they're examining. Certainly, if you do a new report, I would always say why this new report and what they might want to look for in that new report. So if you've not done an accounts receivable aging report before and you decide to do one, your comment might say, this shows you where we are regarding payments from our fee-for-service contracts, and you will see that we are 3 months behind in our receivables on our pre-ETS program. All right, you put that in there. This is why the new report, and here's what you might want to look at or notice about the report. So anytime there's something in the report, though, that's unusual or you think might not make sense to somebody looking at it, you've all had the experience where somebody who doesn't really understand financial reports is looking at something and saying, wait a minute, why is this the case? And you want to be able to explain anything like that to prevent that misunderstanding. So if there's an entry that's clear or seems unclear or seems unusual, you'll want to put that note in there. I find that often boards don't understand depreciation, for example. And so an explanation of what depreciation is and that it is not actually an expense that you paid out of pocket is useful for people who aren't used to looking at financial statements. So you might find that that's useful in certain circumstances with your board, especially if you're reporting something new or depreciating something new that you hadn't been depreciating before. If you're drawing any conclusions, you or the executive director or both of you together are drawing any conclusions from the reports, it's important to say, please notice X. As a result of this information, we determined this, and the action we're going to take is this. Because it clarifies that report instead of just handing them numbers. And I can't emphasize this enough. You have some board members who may be very comfortable with the financial information, But I guarantee you, some of your board members are not. And you know that, especially if you meet with the board of directors yourself. So do take time to put notes or explanations into your financial reports. Anything that's going to be useful for your board members and your executive director, but for them to know in order to understand and use those tools. Now, here's the touchy part before we break off for our private conversations that's not online. What if your CEO doesn't want you as the accountant or bookkeeper to meet with the board? First of all, for those of you who are CEOs here, I really do recommend that you have your bookkeeper or accountant meet with your board of directors. And I recommend that for transparency, because it is important for the board to feel, okay, I can trust that the information being brought to me is not being filtered or hidden, or aspects hidden from me, right? So if the board meets with the bookkeeper or the accountant in some way, that's going to help that to happen. You should have policies and procedures around internal controls in your financial policies and procedures. We have samples if you want to see some. One of those practices is to assure that the board has the knowledge they need to be in control of the finances. So the policies should say that they are the ones responsible, and the policies should say that either the finance chair or the accountant or the bookkeeper, and not the ED, presents the reports. Now, once they're presented, certainly the ED or CEO can have as much additional input, make as many comments, point out whatever you want to point out and so forth. But somehow, someone other than the ED ought to be presenting that financial information. And I don't like to go down that rabbit hole of bad things that can happen in centers, but I can tell you right now that there are centers out there where the ED has prevented anyone else from presenting the financial information, and they have filtered it or kind of brushed over and skipped over things that were important. And as a result, the board did not have the information they needed. And there came a time when it was a big problem because the ED was doing something they shouldn't have been doing. Not always illegal, although sometimes it was, but sometimes just foolish. They didn't know what they should be doing. But sometimes they knew they didn't have control, and they didn't want the board to know because they kept thinking, oh, I'll fix this next month. And it didn't get done, and it didn't get done, and it didn't get done. So when you look at this issue of transparency, my first question is, can you influence the written policies to assure that transparency happens? If your ED doesn't want you at the meeting, can you meet with the finance chair so that that person knows what you are presenting, and that's who presents it to the board? You can go over it with them in advance, maybe. Also, when you're meeting with your auditor, which you do quite a bit as the bookkeeper or the accountant, when you're meeting with the auditor, can you ask that auditor, could you recommend policies and practices that provide more transparency so that the board is more aware of what our financial status is? And the auditor will do that. I mean, they will listen to you too, besides their own observations, because you're there day to day. They want to hear what you have to say. So take a look at that. You have an ethical responsibility, especially if you know or suspect that the board doesn't understand or know what's going on. hopefully you can have a conversation with your CEO and they want to do the right thing and they agree with you and they say, oh yeah, that's a great idea. We will have the finance chair do the presentation. Could you go over the finances with them beforehand? So that they're prepared to make that presentation and it'll all be fine when you push these additional ethical transparency issues. But if that CEO or ED is defensive about it or doesn't want to be transparent for whatever reason, it could mean your job. And I don't want to gloss over that. Your reality is that there are CEOs out there who are not doing the right thing. And when you push for the right thing, they may go with you or they may oppose you and take you out of the picture. So just be aware of that. I've got my contact information here. I've got an evaluation survey, which Joey will also post in the chat. And with that, we're going to stop sharing the screen. He's already posted for you where you can find the information for this presentations. It'll be posted on our website so you can see that again. And I'm going to find my Zoom page and stop the